Hello and welcome to Richard's Comics. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the X-Men. And first off, I'd like to introduce my friend, Steven.
Hello, how are you? Steve. I grew up with Richard. We all got into comic books about the same time. And actually, a lot of these books you see behind me are trade paperbacks. A lot of the books we collected. What, about 30 years?
It's probably been about a good 30 years, early 90s.
And I actually started getting comic books when I was young. My dad would go to Weigel's and get them for me, which was a gas station. So I've been collecting comic books. I guess for me someone has, but collecting myself since I guess, 12?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay.
And just to do a little backstory on myself, like Steven said, been collecting for about 30 years now. Originally focused on Marvel books, the Spider-Man, X-Men, and then kind of branched off into Batman and Superman as the years went. Today we want to talk about X-Men in particular. As everyone knows, the X-Men really came to prominence back when Chris Claremont relaunched the title with X-Men back in the late 70s. That's really when it got going. This book we have in front of us, this is a trade paperback of Extinction Agenda, which was written by Chris Claremont and drawn by Jim Lee. This series printed in 1991, and it ran through Uncanny X-Men, New Mutants, and X-Factor. And this really helped bring all the different X titles together where they'd been going on their separate plot lines. Steven?
Yeah, this is like the height. To me, this is the height of the mountain of the X-Men as the Extinction Agenda, because Chris Claremont had written it since the 70s, and this all the way up to the 90s. He had written off and on, but mostly been involved. And then Jim Lee is widely considered. He got his big break on X-Men, who, of course, Jim Lee is one of the most legendary artists in comic history. And this was probably the height of his work was X-Men in terms of how good he could get or be. And so that's why we put this in front of the center, is to show the glory days of the X-Men, because we're not so much in the glory days now.
It doesn't seem that way. This is Extinction Agenda, for those familiar with X-Men. Every summer, they would have a big crossover event. It really got started, what would you say, with Mutant Massacre?
Mm-hmm.
And that started in the late 80s. And then every year they would have, for example, they had Mutant Massacre, I think about 87. Then we had Inferno. Then we had Extinction Agenda. We had later stories like Executioner's Song. And then even up into the mid-90s, we ran into things like Age of Apocalypse. That was a complete, what would you say, just an alternate universe story?
Oh yeah, alternate universe where it gets corrected at some point.
Right.
Alternate versions, which was really popular.
Right, absolutely.
Probably the last just massive event the X-Men had that was that popular. So.
Absolutely. I think at the same time we need to point out at Age of Apocalypse, this is back when Marvel, it seems hard to believe nowadays, but they actually declared bankruptcy in about 96, 97. Age of Apocalypse came out just prior to this, but even before that, some of the classic Avengers covers like Captain America, Iron Man, they weren't selling very well, and they farmed them out.
No, the kind of the loser comics for Marvel in terms of moneymakers were the Avengers, which is hard for anyone to believe now, because that's where the big money is in the movies and all the merchandising. But really, the X-Men and Spider-Man really carried the company, which is why Marvel, when they did the bankruptcy, they sold the rights to a bunch of their properties that were the most popular. The X-Men, that's why Fox had the X-Men rights. Columbia and Sony had Spider-Man rights, but nobody wanted to buy the Avengers because they said they couldn't make any money off of it.
That's right.
That's the only reason Marvel then became as successful as they were, is they had the characters no one wanted, and that's when they started making movies, and the rest is history after Disney buys them. So
absolutely. So we're going to circle back, and we'll focus on X-Men today, but we would like to do some more videos talking about, especially when the Avengers were not doing well and they farmed them out to some of the image creators like Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee and whatnot. But today we do want to focus on X-Men. So we've talked about the Mountain, and it really ran from about 77 to about 95, 96. And as we said, this Extinction Agenda came out in 91. Now after that, something funny kind of happened. Like, the events weren't as popular. No. Chris Claremont wasn't really writing the title. All their big artists like Jim Lee had gone to Image. So what did they do?
Well, the philosophy, it seemed like to me the philosophy of the X-Men started to change. So back in this era, you had in the 60s, you had the mutants, they were outcast people. It was an allegory for racism and people who were different. But they were trying to, Professor X was a Martin Luther King figure who was essentially trying to show the world that the X-Men, just because they were born different, were heroes and just like everybody else. And so that went through the 60s, and then the 70s was where Chris Claremont came on, and the 5 original X-Men, who maybe were never quite as popular, that's when you got Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Colossus, a new team of X-Men.
Storm, yeah.
That was a big jump in the title. And then, of course, the art was John Byrne, and Chris Claremont was the writer. That went for a while, and they had a lot of stories through the 70s on that. And at some point, they kind of broke the X-Men up and then pulled them back together in the late 80s, early 90s, to where you had kind of the team you know now, where they're all kind of mixed together. But somewhere in that process, the theme continued where the X-Men were mutants. They were persecuted, but they were going to save the world anyway,
Right.
and were the best example of mutant kind, basically. And again, the allegory continued, but somewhere the allegory shifted to a much more militant.
It did.
Thing.
It did. They had stories where they had Utopia, where they had the island off of San
Their
Francisco.
own island, so they separated from the United
Yeah.
States, which was, it's a good story for short term. Like, it makes a great, 5, 6, 10 issues.
Yeah.
But it lasted for like 3 years.
It was several years,
Yeah.
and they even, and additionally, some of the other mutants, like the Magneto, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, all of a sudden you started bringing them in, and they were allowed on Utopia.
Yeah, Magneto was always kind of an anti-hero anyway, somewhat, even though he was much
He
more...
was kind of the Malcolm X to Professor Xavier's
exactly.
Dark Martin.
Exactly.
Dark
He started
Martin
kind of
King.
coming over to the side of being more reasonable
Right.
and more of a hero, and so mutants had to band together. Maybe that was the genesis when they started pulling in people like Magneto and Namor, who was kind of militant about being a mutant. It started changing the X-Men a little bit,
Yeah.
and they seemed to quit being quite so heroic and more, what can we do for ourselves?
Yeah, they kind of got away from saving the people, even though that they hate and fear them. Xavier's dream was always peaceful coexistence.
Well, Xavier was dead for a period of that time. Maybe that was a difference as well. So.
That could be. That could be. I mean, earlier I think it was Uncanny X-Men 200 is the trial of Magneto. And at that time, Xavier was missing. But even back then, Magneto wanted to continue Xavier's vision. So they, even though humans hated and feared the mutants, they were still looking to save them. They didn't deviate from Xavier's vision. Now, when we get to the era that Steven's talking about, now we're kind of seeing, well, we need to worry about preserving the mutants. It seems like we're getting away from, well, the mutants are heroes. The X-Men are heroes. And we're getting away from that. And so we're starting to deviate in about late 90s, 2000s. We're getting away from what originally brought people to X-Men.
That's right. And then, of course, it keeps progressing, and then you have stories. You have something called Schism. Which came out, about 7 years ago, 8 years ago?
Yeah, probably about 2010-ish.
Yeah, so Cyclops, who'd become the most militant, to the point of running essentially a mutant death squad that Wolverine was on.
The X-Force title that they
yeah,
relaunched, right?
Which is way from where the characters had ever been. Even though Wolverine obviously had always had blood on his hands to some extent. Then Wolverine's the voice of reason and says, "What are we doing? We should be training young mutants." Kind of like Xavier, training young mutants to protect themselves and protect humanity. And he was fighting back against that. And then they break up, and it kind of became a mess, I think, for a while.
Yeah, they had the Schism miniseries that you mentioned, and then they split into two titles. They had Uncanny X-Men under Cyclops, and then we had Wolverine the X-Men that was more kind of reestablishing. I believe he called it the Jean Grey School for Mutants, because this time Jean Grey was dead because she died back during the new X-Men run by Grant Morrison. So
it became a soap opera a little bit.
It kind of did.
Or just drama. Maybe that's wrong. I mean, comic books are always kind of soap opera.
Well, they had soap, but there's more to it than
that.
It
became all
focused.
drama. There's a lot of drama and discontent and violence, and it really wasn't like it used to be. And then, of course, now, eventually, they pull all the X-Men together, and here's the crazy. So the X-Men always had the best stable of villains, wouldn't you say?
They did, absolutely.
In terms of just...
Maybe Batman, but the X-Men are right
the
there.
amount of villains, Apocalypse and
Magneto,
Mr. Sinister,
Toad,
all these
great
90s era, 80s era villains, Omega Red, all these different... And they all had different... They were all mutants or related to mutants, but they were all kind of on their own. Mr. Sinister wanted to mess with genes and create the ultimate being. Apocalypse just wanted to kill everybody.
Mutants were
going to be the next race.
Mutants were weak and inferior.
Yeah. And then a bunch of them just want to make money with their mutant powers. I mean, it's just
Sebastian Shaw.
All these, all the way to Sabretooth, who's essentially a mutant serial killer and psycho.
He's a psychopath. He is.
And so then the current state of the X-Men, at some point Xavier's back alive, which has happened like 8 times.
But to stop there, so we've got this chaotic period, like what we're talking about. It's pretty chaotic. We had Schism that broke up the X-Men. We had Wolverine kind of going back to Xavier's original goal. We have Cyclops kind of going to Magneto's goal. And then what happens? We have something called, more recently in the last 3 years, we had House of X and Powers of X.
Right, that's right. And that's kind of what put the X-Men in their current state. All of a sudden, which you jump in on the scrap. All of a sudden, the X-Men, Xavier's back, and he goes, "I've got a great idea. Instead of being the character I've been for like 70 years, how about we just put all mutants on an island, Krakoa, and we're going to basically isolate from humanity, and we're better than everyone else."
Yeah, they got away. They're like, we're superior now. And then we should probably mention too the really big change to Moira McTaggart about how she's a mutant now.
Yeah, and the X-Men, all of a sudden you had all these characters who were all really, that's the great thing about the X-Men, all the different characters, Wolverine, Gambit, Cable, everyone had their own personality and their own thoughts, and all of a sudden they all just start drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
They're all going to live on an island together with Charles Xavier and be, I guess, be everything that humans ever said they were.
They even have, I mean, this is the first event. I remember reading Powers of X and House of X. This is the first time I remember rooting for the evil bad guys to actually beat the X-Men.
No, it gets worse. And
Why do you root for the bad guys?
So then Xavier says,
wrong.
I'm going to let every mutant on that. I want every mutant to be here.
Even
so
the
all
killers.
All of a sudden, all these guys that killed multiple people in Apocalypse, who in a future version of reality essentially creates the apocalypse and kills almost all of humanity. Hey, just come live on the island with us. And then they start drinking the Kool-Aid.
It's
amazing.
It's kumbaya.
Yeah, everybody's just living together. And you got people who literally, crucified Wolverine at one point.
Oh, yes.
Who's living on an island
They did.
The
classic Wolverine being, now that's when they were in Australia, right?
Right, yeah.
That's back in the 80s. And we've gone full circle now. All of a sudden,
makes no sense.
What about, we're letting people like the Hellfire Club in?
Yep.
Those are good Samaritans. We got Apocalypse, like you said, who's been literally trying to wipe out everyone for millennia.
Right.
We got Magneto, who wanted to do things like wipe out all the humans because they were inferior.
Well, and one could start and just say it's poor writing, and it probably is, because you're taking all these characters and you're just homogenizing them all together, and it just throws a lot of the history out. But the other problem is, it's funny that we put up Extinction Agenda, because this story was about an island, fake island called Genosha, which happened to be off the coast of Africa. And in the Genosian nation, they decided that they would outlaw mutants and try to change them into being humans.
Mutates.
Yeah, and so this whole thing, they kidnap the X-Men. There's this whole thing where they're fighting an island full of humans who want to get rid of mutants because they feel they're better than they are. Well, now it's funny, the X-Men fought against that, and it was a great story. But now we've actually just flip-flopped positions. Now we have the X-Men living on their own island who hate humans and don't want humans around.
They see them as unevolved savages.
Right. And so, really, the X-Men have become the Genosians now.
Well, and then mention the other part about the society on Genosha. It was they took mutants and they made them mutates, and they basically are automatons where they're just slaves for the state. And now we're to Krakoa, where we've brought all the mutants in and we're all happy, and yet. How do you even explain it? You bring them all in, and they're basically looking at humans as pawn scum.
Yeah, and they're going to wait for them to all die off.
And we're not just talking about Apocalypse. We can understand. We're not talking about Sinister, Sebastian Shaw, all the rogues. We're talking about characters like Wolverine.
Mm-hmm.
It's Xavier.
A samurai moral code.
Storm.
Who also has a moral code.
Nightcrawler.
Yeah.
This is a guy who's a certified Catholic priest who's about saving people, and all of a sudden he's on this bandwagon to basically wait till the humans go extinct. It's completely contrary to the whole story of the X-Men, going back to '63 when it launched, going back to New X-Men, I think that was in 1975 when Giant Size X-Men. We're completely getting away from what, at least in our eyes, what the original intent and view of the X-Men is.
Well, and then there's this hostility toward characters like other heroes, like Captain America, Tony Stark, who they used to, there's a whole history in Marvel Comics of them working together.
That's right.
And in fact, the heroes in Marvel Comics, for the most part, even though the X-Men have accused them in the past of not doing enough to really present mutants in a positive light and to take a stand against the bigotry, really, Captain America, Spider-Man, these are people who have been allies of the mutants for years.
For decades.
Like, to the risk of their own reputation. Now you're human.
It's like you're the enemy.
Yeah, and it's created hostility, rightly so, with the other heroes, because they're not really heroes anymore, the X-Men. The X-Men are exactly what everyone said they were, which is sad if you read.
If you go back, you're proving people like Graydon Creed, the Friends of Humanity, you're justifying what the mutants fought against, what the X-Men fought against.
Right.
And again, you can understand from the Sabretooths, the evil mutants.
Right.
But from the X-Men, from X-Factor, Excalibur, New Mutants, the people who had sacrificed, who have died, who have fought to save people, all of a sudden you're gonna jump on the Apocalypse bandwagon. It doesn't make sense. So,
Marvel, it's a moneymaker. Right?
Well,
I mean,
it was, and that's the other reason we want to talk about it. X-Men was what it would be top 5 every month. Right. X-Men title, and this was up to Age of Apocalypse for the mid '90s. But now you look at X-Men. Are they in the top 50? I don't know. I haven't looked at the charts, but they're not in the top anymore.
Well, and this, I think, so the writer of the story, and my brain just went blank.
Well, we got Jonathan Hickman.
Right, Jonathan Hickman, who kind of came up with this idea. I think if you looked at it, it seemed to me like Hickman, when he did it, it was supposed to blow up in their face. I think the story was written as, Xavier had this great idea, let's invite the villains, let's all be kumbaya. And then the allegory of the story was, it was not going to be kumbaya after a year because all those disparate interests would clash.
Right.
And I think the lesson, which would have fit right in with this, is that it doesn't really work. Isolating on an island with your own kind is going to be the same thing as being with it. There's going to be conflict no matter what. And instead, Marvel saw the boost in sales because of this. They put out 2 limited series.
The bubble and boosting
right,
sales.
The bubble. And they go, let's just keep it going for 3 years.
That's right.
Which then made them have to make decisions where someone like Wolverine, who after a couple of years would have gone, wait a minute, this is overboard.
Yeah.
Now they've got to start drinking more Kool-Aid where they're drowning in it for Marvel to keep the comics going in that direction. To the point that now don't they have Mars now? They take another planet over and terraform it. And
that's right.
Planet. And it's just gotten ridiculous.
I think that was the X-Men Red. No, the X-Men Planet Size.
Yeah, so they have a planet that they've taken over.
That's right.
And terraformed with their mutant power. Oh, and the worst part, they've used the other mutants to now the X-Men can't die.
That's
They've
right. We have
mutants
the
that
5.
can bring them back to life. So now they can't get killed, which kind of takes away the narrative stakes of the story, in my opinion, because you just bring them back to life. And then these people who survived for 60 years of comicdom now get killed every other issue, which means how good were they before?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Before this, how did no one get killed? I mean, they got killed and they came back, but it was always explained. Now it's in some way they didn't die, or they were born through a portal. Now they just bring them back to life willy-nilly. And Wolverine, they grow him a new body, happens to have adamantium. That's just bad writing.
Oh, that's just a plot hole.
Yeah.
But what Steven's referring to, the resurrection protocols, we have the 5 mutants led by Hope Summers, who are, like he's saying, it's basically like you're playing a video game and you ran out of lives and all you do is pop another quarter in the next issue and you got all new characters.
It's basically like Jumanji with unlimited lives.
But I mean, it takes the drama out, it takes the suspense out of it. And like you said, you have characters who didn't get killed for the first 4 decades of their existence. All of a sudden now they're dropping like flies. But hey, who cares? We're going to resurrect them anyway. So, I mean, where's the suspense? Where's the drama? You don't have it. And then on top of that, in my opinion, we have assassinated these characters. And again, I'm not talking about the bad evil mutants. We're talking about the X-Men. We're talking about Xavier here.
And it's funny because I haven't read a lot of it. I've read some of it. But even when you get into Wolverine's solo book, Wolverine has this big moral code, and then it's like they have to forget about it when you go back to the X-Men to make the Krakoa thing
Now,
work.
that's a bigger program problem that they have.
But that's what I'm saying. It shows that they're having to change it to make this work, because when they have solo stuff, they're the same characters. So it just...
Yeah, it's the old, square peg in a round hole.
Right.
That's what we're doing. So I guess, we currently in X-Men, they have a story. They're doing the latest Hellfire event, which... don't even get me started on that, because that is, I don't know, it seems cold contrary to, again, what we've been talking about. It's just to further, in our opinion, the assassination, the fall of the X-Men. And personally, both of us feel we have some good writers nowadays. We have plenty of good artists. We really want to go back to the good versus evil. The X-Men who, even though humanity fears and hates them, they're still going to fight for you. And we're not doing that. And we want to go back to these times. We want to go back to the summer crossovers where death means something, even in comics, where you have clearly good and bad fighting, not the current soap opera going on right now.
It's like Game of Thrones on an island with mutants.
Yeah, it's Game of Thrones. Yeah.
Which is... It sounds better than it is.
The late seasons of Game of Thrones that a lot of people did not like. The ones that were very polarizing, to be kind.
Yeah, exactly. And so, so it's homogenized a group of characters that was what was great about them, was that they were not homogenous. I mean, the X-Men had all this infighting. That's what made them great. They're like a family of disparate people who didn't get along.
That's right.
But yet still, the one thing that linked them is they had this mutant gene that they were born with and couldn't get rid of, so they're going to use it for good, despite jerks, that didn't.
That's right.
And they're all celebrities too, right? I mean, that's the other thing. Like, now everyone knows who the X-Men are, and they're like in People magazine.
Oh,
it's kind of,
they're going to places like the
ridiculous.
UN. They're going to the UN. They're on television.
Kind of like The Boys. They've almost made the X-Men, the characters in Marvel, celebrities, and that's fine for The Boys, but that's not Marvel Comics. And I guess it's all just, I don't know, it's all just to sell. And people talk about woke things that go on here and there, but that's not very forward thinking to go backwards with characters. I mean, forward thinking was what they were doing in the '60s. Like, now they're going backwards in kind of a weird way. So this is a topic we wanted to talk about today. I think we've hit a lot of the points, and I think both of us would really like a new look. Even though I hesitate to say relaunch, but we really feel that we need the right people involved. Yeah, or something.
We need to get back, and in our opinion, we'd like them to go back to where they were. Xavier Institute for Higher Learning. Let's go back to West Salem, New York. Let's really differentiate the mutants that we know and love, the actual X-Men, who are fighting for good even though the world hates them. And then they're fighting against people like Apocalypse, who his very definition is trying to bring an end to the world. So
when we were 12 and picking up these issues, I mean, it was exciting. I can't imagine a kid going in a comic store and picking up an issue of X-Men now and reading about what their mission is and just the drama on the island that has no real action or no real stake. I don't get how a kid would get into comics now. I really don't. And they'd have to know 30 years of history to even start reading. These you could jump right in.
You could.
Because you didn't need, it'd be great to have this, or you didn't need it.
Yeah.
And now you need a thesaurus and 2 encyclopedia volumes to read a comic book.
Well, do you want 2 pages of action and then people debating morals and some of these other things in the comic the whole time? Because that's not what Extinction Agenda was. Yeah, they had some deeper thoughts, but there was action. But anyway, we do appreciate you being with us today and listening to us talk about X-Men. You can tell we're obviously very passionate about it. We're hoping to bring you some more videos in the future. Appreciate your time and have a good day.